How does an invincible army, led by a man believed to be a living god, get annihilated by a force nearly half its size? The answer lies with one of the most brutal leaders in history, a grueling death march that pushed an empire to its breaking point, and a single, unforgivable insult involving a box of opium. This is the story of a battle that didn't just end a war, it ended an entire age of warfare, redrawing the map of the Middle East with gunpowder and blood. Our story begins not with kings in their palaces, but with an army dying in a wasteland. By the high summer of 1514, the elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, the most feared military force in the world, were tasting hell on earth. For months, their sultan, Selim I, had driven them eastward across the barren, sun-blasted plains of Anatolia. They were chasing a phantom, an enemy who refused to fight, an enemy who had turned the very land into a weapon. This was a moving city of over 80,000 men, a behemoth of infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers, and it was starving to death. The sun was a merciless hammer in a cloudless sky, cracking the earth and the spirits of men. Water came from brackish wells, often tainted by the retreating enemy, carrying dysentery through the ranks like a whispered curse. The great herds of pack animals, camels and oxen that pulled the supply wagons, and the massive cannons had begun to die off, their carcasses left rotting on the trail, a grim testament to the campaign's folly. The soldiers, once fed on hearty rations of rice, bread, and mutton, were now reduced to chewing on boiled leather and whatever roots they could scavenge from the poisoned soil. This was not war. It was a slow, agonizing disintegration. The enemy, the Safavid Persians under Shah Ismail, had employed the most brutal and effective strategy imaginable: scorched earth. They burned every field of wheat, destroyed every granary, and drove away every head of livestock. They left nothing behind but dust and despair, seeking to let hunger and the punishing landscape do what no army had ever managed, to break the will of the Ottomans. And it was working. Discipline, the bedrock of the Ottoman army, began to crack. The grumbling of the common soldiers turned into open defiance. But the true danger came from the heart of the army, the Janissaries. The Sultan's personal slave infantry, the most disciplined and feared fighting force on the planet, were at their limit. They were warriors, forged in the harshest training imaginable, but they were not spectres to be marched into a dusty grave. Their discontent festered in the stifling heat until it finally exploded. In an astonishing act of mutiny, a detachment of Janissaries surrounded the Sultan's command tent and fired their muskets into the air, their shots a deafening roar of protest. They had made their decision. The campaign was over. The army would go no further. They had forgotten, however, who their leader was. Sultan Selim I, a man who had ripped the throne from his own father and strangled his brothers to secure it, emerged from his tent. He was not a man who negotiated, he commanded. He strode into the midst of the mutinous soldiers, his face a mask of cold fury. There were no pleas or promises. He did not offer them food or rest. Instead, he offered them an ultimatum. He drew his scimitar and held it aloft. "Is this the courage of the soldiers of the Sultan?" he roared, his voice cutting through the discontent. He spoke of the enemy they were chasing, this heretic who called himself a god, and reminded them of their sacred duty. He shamed their cowardice and extolled the virtues of martyrdom and the glories of victory. His iron will, forged in the brutal crucible of Ottoman power politics, was more potent than their exhaustion. His fury was more terrifying than starvation. The mutiny melted away under his gaze, replaced by a grim, renewed sense of purpose. The army would march on, but why? What kind of burning hatred could fuel such a campaign, compelling a leader to risk his entire army, his very throne, on a death march into a hostile wasteland? The answer was not a what, but a who. Shah Ismail, the god-king of Persia, the man Selim saw as the ultimate threat to his world. While Selim's men chewed on leather, Shah Ismail and his warriors held court. They were the mirror opposite of the grim, methodical Ottomans. They were a firestorm of passionate, mystical faith. Their leader, Shah Ismail I, was a figure plucked from legend, a descendant of Sufi mystics. He had emerged from hiding as a boy of 14, to rally the fractured Turkoman tribes of Persia. He was a gifted poet, whose verses spoke of his divine connection, and a warrior of such ferocious charisma that his followers believed he was literally untouchable. His warriors, known as the Qizilbash, or Redheads, for their distinctive crimson turbans, with 12 tassels representing the 12 Shia imams, saw him as far more than a king. He was the Mahdi, a prophesied redeemer, a manifestation of God's will on earth. This belief was his greatest weapon. It forged an army of 40,000 of the world's most formidable horsemen into an instrument of holy war. They charged into battle without armor, chanting his poetry, convinced that their faith made them invulnerable and that to die in his service was the highest possible honor. In a series of breathtaking victories, this boy king and his fanatical followers had conquered all of Persia, establishing the Safavid Empire and declaring Shia Islam as its state religion, a direct challenge to the Sunni dominance of the Ottoman Sultan. For years, this formula of divine right and unstoppable cavalry had proven invincible. Shah Ismail, now a young man of 27, had never known a single defeat. The animosity between the two rulers was not just political, it was a deeply personal venom. Selim, the ruthless guardian of Sunni orthodoxy, saw Ismail as a dangerous heretic, a cancer on the body of Islam that had to be cut out. Ismail, the messianic poet king, saw Selim as a stagnant, illegitimate tyrant, an obstacle to a divinely ordained destiny. Their courts exchanged a series of scathing letters that dripped with contempt. But it was one infamous exchange that sealed their fates in blood. As Selim marshaled his forces for the invasion, the Shah sent him a diplomatic gift. A lavishly decorated golden box arrived in the Sultan's camp. When Selim opened it, he found it filled not with jewels or peace offerings, but with opium. The message was a dagger of pure disdain. You are a soft, decadent drug addict, a coward who dulls his senses in a palace, not a true warrior. The insult was unforgivable. Selim, in a cold rage, ordered the Persian messenger to be executed. He then sent back a gift of his own, a collection of traditional Ottoman robes, perfumes, and sweets. The counter-insult was just as sharp. You are an immature child, a boy playing dress-up who does not understand the deadly games of men. The diplomatic channels were closed. This would not be a war for territory. It would be a war of annihilation, a personal feud between two titans who saw the world as too small for both of them. Ismail was certain that his glorious redheads, the greatest cavalry on earth, would simply sweep the tired, half-starved Ottomans from the field. But his men, who believed their faith was their only necessary armor, were about to face a new kind of god, one made of iron, sulfur, and gunpowder. The Ottoman war machine that lumbered across the wasteland was the most modern army of its time. It was a terrifying fusion of ancient Roman discipline and futuristic firepower. At its core were the 12,000 Janissaries. They were not born into a warrior class. They were made into one. Recruited through the Devshirme system, they were taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and raised as slaves of the Sultan. Their family was the core, their father was the Sultan, and their only craft was war. They were subjected to a lifetime of grueling training in archery, wrestling, and, most importantly, the use of the matchlock musket. In an age where the mounted knight was still the symbol of military power, the Janissaries were a terrifying glimpse into the future, a disciplined wall of professional infantry that could unleash coordinated, rolling volleys of fire, a tactic that could shred any cavalry charge. And then there were the cannons. Selim had dragged an enormous artillery train of over 500 pieces across 1,000 miles of punishing terrain. These were not the crude iron bombards of the previous century. The Ottomans were masters of bronze casting, capable of creating cannons of immense size and power. There were light, agile anti-personnel guns, designed to fire canister-shot canvas bags, filled with lead balls and scrap iron that turned the cannon into a giant shotgun. And there were the massive siege guns, the super weapons of their day, capable of hurling huge stone balls that had shattered the legendary walls of Constantinople. The logistics of moving these behemoths were staggering, but Selim knew they were his trump card. the Safavids disdained firearms as the cowardly weapons of those who feared to meet their enemy face to face. They had no cannons, no muskets, no tactical answer to the storm that was coming. Selim was betting everything on a single, decisive battle where his technology could methodically annihilate the Safavids' peerless, fanatical courage. Finally, after months of hardship, the moment had come. On the 23rd of August, 1514, the two armies deployed on the plain of Chaldiran. The contrast was a vision from two different ages. On the high ground, the Safavids were a breathtaking sea of crimson banners and polished steel. 40,000 horsemen, fresh and crackling with a confident energy that bordered on arrogance, chanted the poems of their god-king. Below them, the 80,000 Ottomans formed a grim, silent, and static line, a somber mass of iron and dark wood. It was passion versus professionalism, explosive movement versus calculated mathematics. Shah Ismail, brimming with the supreme confidence of a man who had never lost, prepared for the only tactic he knew, the all-out, overwhelming cavalry charge. He and his commanders looked down at the Ottoman formation and saw what they believed was fear. The enemy was not arrayed for an attack, but huddled behind a strange barricade of wagons. They interpreted it as a defensive camp, a sign of weakness from a tired and broken army. Ismail's plan was brutally simple. He would personally lead half his army in a massive flanking maneuver to crush the Ottoman right wing, while his most trusted general, the governor of Diyarbakir, did the same to the left. They would be a whirlwind of steel, a human tidal wave designed to envelop and destroy the tired invaders before they even knew what hit them. But Selim had not built a camp. He had built a killing field. His strategy was a masterpiece of military engineering. He had arranged hundreds of his supply carts and wagons into a long, fortified barricade, the tabur. The wagons were chained together, wheel to wheel, creating a makeshift wall that could absorb and break the momentum of even the most ferocious charge. Behind this wall, he placed his elite janissaries, protected from the cavalry and given a stable platform from which to fire their muskets. And in the gaps between the wagons, like predators lying in wait, he placed the dark mouths of his cannons. His own cavalry, the Sipahis, were placed on the flanks with one grim order: do not win, just hold. Hold for as long as you can and absorb the initial ferocious impact. Selim was baiting a trap on a monumental scale. He was inviting the world's greatest horsemen to charge directly into the teeth of the world's greatest collection of firepower. The tension on the field was a physical thing. The air was still. The fate of two empires, the future of warfare, and the lives of over 120,000 men rested on the next few moments. Gunpowder or cavalry, technology or faith. An entire age of warfare was about to be decided in a single bloody afternoon. Let us know in the comments below who you think will win this epic showdown. The charge began as a rumble, a tremor in the earth that grew into a deafening roar. 40,000 red heads, screaming their devotion to Ismail, surged forward in a wave of crimson and steel. This was the force that had conquered an empire, an avalanche of men and horses that had never been stopped. For a few terrifying moments, it looked like this time would be no different. Shah Ismail, a whirlwind of destruction at the head of his men, smashed into the Ottoman right flank with apocalyptic force. The Ottoman provincial horsemen, the Sipahis, tired and outnumbered, stood no chance. The line didn't just bend, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The Qizilbash, with their superior skill and fanatical bravery, tore through them, routing them completely and carving a bloody path deep into the Ottoman rear. On the other flank, the charge was just as devastating. The battle devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee of individual combat, exactly the kind of fight where the individual skill and reckless bravery of the Qizilbash horsemen always prevailed. Their victory seemed all but certain, but Selim had planned for this. His flanks were sacrificial lambs. They were designed to crumble and absorb the initial, unstoppable shock. The real battle, the one that would decide history, would be fought in the center. As the victorious Qizilbash cavalry, disorganized from their successful charge, wheeled around to smash into what they thought was the vulnerable Ottoman camp, they ran into the trap. Confident and drunk on their initial success, They charged headlong at the barricades of wagons, expecting to sweep them aside and finish the slaughter. And then, Sultan Selim gave the order. A wall of fire and steel erupted from the Ottoman line. The 500 cannons, silent until this moment, roared to life as one. They didn't fire solid cannonballs to break walls. They fired canister shots. The effect was that of 500 giant shotguns firing at once, a devastating volley of iron and lead that tore through the densely packed ranks of the charging cavalry. The front lines of the redhead charge simply vanished, obliterated in a storm of shrapnel and gore. Men and horses were torn into bloody ruin. The unstoppable wave of horsemen was stopped dead, their charge broken not by a shield wall, but by a force of nature they could not comprehend. Before the shocked survivors could react, before they could even process the carnage, the 12,000 janissaries behind the wagons leveled their muskets. In a single, disciplined motion, practiced for a lifetime, they unleashed a rolling volley of fire. The noise was a continuous, deafening thunder, and the smoke was so thick it choked the air, blotting out the sun and turning the battlefield into a murky, terrifying hellscape. The Qizilbash, their ears ringing, their eyes blinded by smoke, their comrades dying all around them, fell into utter chaos. Their faith could not stop bullets. Their courage was useless against cannons. For the first time in their lives, the invincible warriors felt terror. Panic replaced zeal. The charge faltered, then broke into a full-scale, desperate rout. Shah Ismail, fighting like a lion in the thick of the battle, was wounded in the arm and thrown from his horse. He was nearly captured, a prize that would have ended the Safavid Empire then and there. He was saved only when a loyal officer named Mirza Sultan Ali, who resembled the Shah, charged the Ottomans, screaming, "I am the Shah." He drew the enemy upon himself, sacrificing his own life to buy his king a few precious seconds to be dragged from the field. Ismail escaped, but he left his honor, his army, and his aura of divinity bleeding in the dust of Chaldiran. The battle was over. The Ottoman victory was absolute. The myth of Shah Ismail's invincibility was shattered in a single bloody afternoon. He fell into a deep depression, traded his sword for a wine cup, and never again led an army into battle. The Ottomans captured his entire camp, including his favorite wife, whom Selim callously married off to one of his subordinates. The psychological blow was as devastating as the military one. The legacy of Chaldiran was profound. It didn't just end a war. It established the borders between the Ottoman and Persian empires, creating a political and cultural fault line that largely persists to this day in the modern border between Turkey and Iran, and defining the Sunni-Shia geopolitical landscape for centuries. More importantly, it was the definitive, bloody announcement that the age of the horse and sword was over. Chaldiran proved, without a doubt, that disciplined infantry armed with gunpowder weapons could defeat the greatest mounted warriors in the world. It sent a shockwave through every court from Europe to Asia, and every ruler took note. It was a brutal lesson, written in blood on a dusty plain, forever changing the way that humanity wages war. The Battle of Chaldiran is a stark reminder that history is often forged in the crucible of technological change, where old ways of fighting clash violently with the new. The courage of the Qizilbash was legendary, but it was shattered against a wall of progress they refused to accept. If you believe stories like this are essential to understanding our world, help us share them by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more epic battles that shaped history. We're always looking for the next incredible story to tell, so let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be brought to life next. Thank you for watching.